I'm Emily Evans, 47 years old, and 3 months ago, my supervisor called me incompetent in front of the entire creative team at Meridian Marketing Agency, the same team I'd built from scratch over 8 years. But what she did afterward to cover up her own failures and steal credit for my work was even worse. If you've ever been undermined at work by someone who took credit for your ideas while sabotaging your reputation, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to join others who understand this kind of professional betrayal. 22 years ago, I walked into my first marketing job at a tiny boutique agency in Portland with a portfolio full of college projects and a head full of dreams. The agency, called Wildcard Creative, operated out of a converted warehouse where the founder, Marcus Chen, had knocked down walls to create these flowing creative spaces filled with vintage furniture he'd rescued from estate sales. The smell of strong coffee and the sound of keyboards clicking mixed with indie music playing from someone's laptop speakers. Marcus became my first real mentor, teaching me that great marketing wasn't about following formulas. It was about understanding human psychology and telling stories that made people feel something. He'd review my campaigns by spreading them across his massive oak desk, pointing out which elements created emotional connection and which ones fell flat. "Emily," he'd say, tracing his finger along my copy, "you understand that people don't buy products, they buy feelings and solutions to problems they didn't even know they had." Those early years shaped everything about how I approached my career. I learned to read market research like detective novels, finding the hidden narratives in consumer behavior data. I discovered I had a gift for taking complex brand messages and distilling them into campaigns that felt both innovative and inevitable. When I presented my first major campaign for a sustainable clothing startup, a concept centered around wearing your values, I watched the client's eyes light up as they saw their mission reflected back to them in a way that would actually sell products. Marcus promoted me to senior creative strategist within 18 months, and I knew I'd found my calling. The agency felt like a family where everyone's ideas mattered, where we'd stay late not because we had to, but because we were genuinely excited about the work we were creating together. After 5 years at Wildcard, I made the difficult decision to move to a larger agency where I could work on national campaigns and bigger budgets. Reynolds and Associates offered me a creative director position with my own team and the opportunity to pitch to Fortune 500 companies. The transition was jarring, from Marcus's warm, collaborative warehouse to a sleek downtown high-rise with designated meeting rooms and formal presentation protocols. But I threw myself into building something special there too. I assembled a team of diverse creatives who brought different perspectives to every project. There was Jake, a brilliant visual designer who could translate abstract concepts into compelling imagery; Maya, a copywriter whose headlines could stop people mid-scroll; and David, a data analyst who helped us prove our creative instincts with hard numbers. Together, we won the agency's first national advertising award for a campaign that increased client sales by 37% while completely shifting their brand perception. The golden period of my career lasted nearly 6 years at Reynolds. I was promoted to executive creative director, overseeing multiple teams and managing relationships with our biggest clients. Industry publications started featuring my work, and I began speaking at marketing conferences about the intersection of data-driven strategy and emotional storytelling. The recognition felt validating, but what mattered most was the culture we'd built. My teams consistently exceeded client expectations because we'd created an environment where people felt safe to take creative risks and challenge conventional thinking. I instituted failure parties where we'd analyze campaigns that didn't work and extract lessons without blame. Young creatives sought me out for mentorship, and I loved watching them develop their own voices and approaches to the work. During this time, I met and married Tom, a freelance photographer whose artistic eye complemented my strategic thinking. We'd spend evenings walking through different neighborhoods, discussing how environmental design influenced human behavior, and noting details that most people missed: the way certain color combinations created feelings of trust, how typography choices communicated values before people consciously processed the words. Tom understood my passion for the work in a way that made me feel completely seen. When I'd come home energized from a successful client presentation or frustrated by agency politics, he'd listen with the kind of attention that helped me think through challenges and celebrate victories fully. But even during the golden years, I noticed subtle shifts happening at Reynolds. The founders were aging and gradually stepping back from day-to-day operations, bringing in younger executives with MBA backgrounds who spoke fluent corporate jargon but seemed disconnected from the creative process. They'd sit in on creative reviews using terms like synergistic brand optimization and customer journey touchpoints, while missing the emotional core of what made campaigns effective. I started seeing talented creatives leave for smaller agencies or start their own consultancies, citing frustration with increasing bureaucracy and decreasing creative freedom. The warning signs were there, but I was too invested in my teams and our success to seriously consider leaving. When Meridian Marketing approached me with an offer to build their creative department from the ground up, it felt like destiny. They were a mid-sized agency specializing in technology and healthcare clients, with ambitious plans to expand into lifestyle and consumer goods markets. Spartian. The CEO, Richard Blackstone, spoke passionately about creating a culture where creativity and strategy worked in perfect harmony. He offered me the title of creative director with complete autonomy to hire my team and develop our creative processes. The salary was competitive, but more importantly, they promised the kind of creative freedom I'd been missing at Reynolds. I remember sitting in their conference room, not the sterile glass boxes you see in every office, but a warm space with exposed brick walls and a massive whiteboard covered in colorful strategy diagrams, and feeling that familiar excitement about building something meaningful from scratch. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly that creative freedom would be threatened by office politics I'd never encountered before. Within my first month at Meridian, I noticed that Rebecca Walsh, the VP of Account Services, had a way of inserting herself into creative conversations where she didn't belong. She joined meetings uninvited, offering suggestions that showed she fundamentally misunderstood both our creative process and our clients' needs. Rebecca was 38, impeccably dressed in the kind of structured blazers and statement jewelry that screamed executive presence, but her ideas about marketing seemed stuck in strategies from 15 years ago. She'd interrupt creative presentations to suggest adding more product shots or making headlines more punchy, completely missing the sophisticated approaches that modern consumers expected. The morning that changed everything started like any other Wednesday. I arrived at the office early, as I always did, stopping by the small kitchen area where someone had arranged fresh pastries from the bakery down the street, one of those thoughtful touches that made Meridian feel different from larger agencies. I was reviewing final mock-ups for the Innovate Health campaign, our biggest client pitch in months, when I noticed my computer screen flickering strangely. My email was open to a thread I didn't remember starting, and several files on my desktop had timestamps from late the previous evening, even though I'd left the office at 6:30. Something felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what. The first team meeting of the day was scheduled for 9 o'clock to review our presentation materials before the client arrived at 11. I'd spent weeks developing a campaign concept that positioned Innovate Health not just as a medical device company, but as a partner in people's wellness journeys. The creative was sophisticated and emotionally resonant, exactly the kind of work that differentiated us from agencies that treated healthcare marketing like selling soap. But when I opened the presentation file, I found changes I'd never approved. Someone had replaced our carefully crafted messaging with generic corporate speak and added stock photos that completely undermined the authentic feel we'd been building. My team gathered in our main conference room, a comfortable space with a long wooden table Tom had helped me select and walls covered with mood boards and campaign concepts in various stages of development. Maya immediately noticed something was wrong. "Emily, these slides look completely different from what we finalized yesterday," she said, scrolling through the presentation on her laptop. Jake pointed out that the color palette had been changed to match Innovate Health's existing brand guidelines exactly, eliminating the subtle evolution we'd proposed to make them feel more contemporary and approachable. David pulled up our analytics showing how similar approaches had failed for their competitors, data that supported our original strategic direction. Before I could respond, Rebecca Walsh entered the room carrying her own laptop and wearing the kind of confident smile that made my stomach drop. "I hope you don't mind," she said, settling into the chair at the head of the table, the spot I usually occupied during creative reviews. "I took the liberty of reviewing your presentation last night and making some adjustments based on my relationship with the client. Trust me, I know what they're looking for." The casual way she announced this, as if it were perfectly normal to completely revise another department's work without consultation, left my entire team staring in stunned silence. "Rebecca," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "we specifically discussed the strategic reasoning behind every element of this campaign. These changes undermine months of research and creative development." She waved her hand dismissively, as if I were being overly dramatic about minor edits. "Sometimes you creative types get too attached to concepts that don't align with business objectives," she replied. "The client wants to see their brand represented in a more traditional, trustworthy way. We can't risk alienating their existing customer base with experimental approaches. The phrase "you creative types" hung in the air like a challenge. My team exchanged glances, and I could see their frustration building. These weren't just experimental approaches. They were carefully researched strategies based on extensive market analysis and consumer psychology principles. Maya started to speak up, but I caught her eye and shook my head slightly. This wasn't the time or place for a confrontation, especially with our biggest client presentation just 2 hours away. Instead, I suggested we review both versions of the presentation and discuss which elements served the client's goals most effectively. What happened next still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. Rebecca opened her laptop and began presenting our campaign to my own team, using my research and insights to support the generic concepts she'd substituted for our original work. She spoke with authority about strategic decisions I'd spent weeks developing, presenting them as if they were collaborative efforts rather than work she'd appropriated. When David tried to reference the competitive analysis that supported our original approach, she cut him off saying, "I appreciate your input, but account management has direct client feedback that trumps theoretical data analysis." The client presentation was a disaster, though not in the way you might expect. Innovate Health CEO and marketing director were polite and professional, but I could see their disappointment as Rebecca walked them through the revised campaign. These were sophisticated executives who'd hired Meridian specifically because they wanted to evolve beyond the cookie-cutter healthcare marketing their previous agency had provided. Instead, we were showing them exactly the kind of generic approach they'd been trying to escape. When they asked about the strategic thinking behind certain creative choices, Rebecca gave surface-level answers that missed the deeper psychological insights that made campaigns truly effective. After the client left, promising to review our materials and get back to us, Rebecca immediately began positioning the lukewarm response as a victory. "See how much more comfortable they seemed with this approach," she told Richard Blackstone, who'd sat in on the presentation. "Sometimes we have to trust account management's instincts about client relationships over creative preferences." The way she framed it made our months of strategic work sound like personal whims rather than professional expertise backed by research and experience. That afternoon, I requested a private meeting with Richard to discuss what had happened. His office was decorated with awards from campaigns he'd led earlier in his career, back when he was more hands-on with creative work. I'd always felt he understood the delicate balance between creative innovation and business results. But when I explained how Rebecca had unilaterally changed our presentation without consultation, he seemed more concerned about maintaining harmony between departments than addressing the fundamental issue of professional boundaries and respect. "Emily, I understand your frustration," he said, leaning back in his leather chair, "but Rebecca has strong relationships with our healthcare clients. Maybe there's a way to blend your creative vision with her account management insights more collaboratively." The word "collaboratively" stung because it implied I hadn't been open to working together, when the reality was that Rebecca had circumvented any possibility of collaboration by making changes in secret and presenting them as final decisions. I left that meeting feeling something I'd never experienced in my career: the sinking realization that my professional judgment and expertise weren't valued or protected by leadership. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with Tom, spreading out printed versions of both presentations, our original strategic approach and Rebecca's generic revision. "Look at this," I said, pointing to the differences. "It's not just about creative preferences. She fundamentally changed our strategic positioning without understanding the market research that supported our approach." Tom studied both versions carefully, his photographer's eye noting details that others might miss. "The original has a clear point of view," he said finally. "The revised version looks like it could be for any healthcare company. It's not just different, it's forgettable." His validation meant everything in that moment, but it also highlighted how isolated I was beginning to feel at work. When your own expertise is being questioned and overruled by someone who doesn't understand the fundamentals of what you do, you start doubting not just your current situation, but your entire professional identity. The next morning brought news that Innovate Health had decided to continue exploring options rather than moving forward with our proposal. Richard called an emergency meeting to discuss what had gone wrong, and I naively expected this to be an opportunity to examine how Rebecca's changes had weakened our pitch. Instead, she had already prepared a narrative that positioned our original creative approach as too risky and experimental for a conservative healthcare client. She presented her analysis with charts and bullet points that made her sound authoritative, even though her conclusions directly contradicted the market research we'd conducted. "Moving forward," Rebecca announced, "I think we need to establish clearer protocols for client presentations." As VP of Account Services, I need to have final approval on all creative materials to ensure they align with client expectations and relationship management strategies. The casual way she proposed this complete restructuring of our creative process, essentially making herself the final arbiter of creative work she wasn't qualified to evaluate, left me speechless. But Richard nodded thoughtfully, as if this sounded like a reasonable solution rather than a fundamental misunderstanding of how creative agencies function effectively. After the meeting, I found myself standing in the hallway outside the conference room, feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. Maya approached cautiously, looking around to make sure no one could overhear us. "Emily, this is crazy," she whispered. "Rebecca doesn't understand the first thing about creative strategy. If she's approving all our work, we're going to lose every pitch to agencies that actually understand modern marketing." Her frustration was palpable, but I could also see fear in her eyes, the recognition that speaking up against office politics could jeopardize her own career. That weekend, I couldn't stop thinking about what was happening at Meridian. I'd built my career on the belief that good work speaks for itself, that clients recognize and value strategic thinking and creative excellence. But I was learning that office politics and relationship management could override expertise and results. Tom and I took long walks through our neighborhood, and I found myself noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. How many for lease signs were posted outside small businesses, evidence of dreams that hadn't survived the realities of competitive markets and difficult personalities. Monday morning brought what felt like the beginning of a coordinated campaign to undermine my authority and expertise. Rebecca had scheduled individual meetings with each member of my team, ostensibly to better understand their creative processes and how account management could support their work more effectively. But when Jake mentioned his meeting to me, it became clear that she was actually gathering ammunition to support her narrative that our creative approach was impractical and disconnected from client needs. She kept asking about times when your strategic decisions had been challenged by clients, Jake told me, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. She wanted specific examples of when research-based approaches had failed, and she seemed frustrated when I couldn't give her what she was looking for. Maya reported a similar experience, with Rebecca pressing for details about creative concepts that clients had rejected or campaigns that hadn't met performance expectations. It was obvious that she was building a case against my leadership style and creative philosophy. The most disturbing part was how Rebecca positioned these conversations as professional development opportunities. She told David that his analytical skills could be better utilized if he focused on supporting account management priorities rather than theoretical creative exploration. To Maya, she suggested that copywriting should prioritize clear communication of product benefits over artistic expression that might confuse consumers. Each conversation was designed to create doubt about our collaborative approach and plant seeds of uncertainty about whether working under my leadership was actually beneficial for their careers. Within 2 weeks, I noticed changes in team dynamics that confirmed my worst fears about Rebecca's influence. David started questioning research methodologies he'd previously embraced enthusiastically, suggesting we focus on simpler metrics that would be easier for account management to understand and communicate to clients. Maya began writing headlines that prioritized obvious product benefits over the subtle emotional connections that made our work distinctive. Jake started designing concepts that looked increasingly similar to competitor campaigns, abandoning the innovative approaches that had defined our creative identity. The breaking point came during our next major client presentation. We were pitching Harmony Foods, a organic snack company looking to expand their market reach beyond health-conscious consumers. I'd developed a campaign concept called Everyday Moments Elevated that positioned their products as small luxuries that made ordinary experiences feel special. The creative was warm and aspirational without being pretentious, supported by research showing that consumers were increasingly seeking affordable ways to treat themselves well. Rebecca had insisted on reviewing the presentation 24 hours before our client meeting, using her new protocol to justify getting early access to our materials. When we gathered for our final team review, I discovered that she'd once again made wholesale changes without consultation. Our sophisticated storytelling approach had been replaced with straightforward product benefit messaging, and the emotional creative had been swapped out for literal images of people eating snacks in obviously staged scenarios. But this time, I was prepared. I'd learned to save multiple versions of our work and document our strategic reasoning in detail. When Rebecca began presenting our revised campaign, I interrupted with questions that exposed the gaps in her understanding. "Rebecca, can you explain how this approach differentiates Harmony Foods from the 17 other organic snack brands using similar messaging?" I asked. "And what research supports the assumption that consumers respond better to literal product demonstrations than emotional storytelling in this category?" The room went silent. My team looked uncomfortable, clearly torn between supporting our original work and avoiding conflict with someone who had positioned herself as having final authority over creative decisions. Rebecca's confident demeanor faltered for the first time, and she began using vague corporate language to deflect my questions. Well, Emily, sometimes we need to prioritize clear communication over creative complexity, she said, but her tone was less certain than usual. That's when I made the decision that changed everything. I think we should present both approaches to the client and let them decide which strategic direction better serves their business goals, I said. After all, they're the ones who will live with the results of this campaign. Rebecca's face flushed with anger, but she couldn't object without admitting that she didn't trust our clients to recognize effective marketing when they saw it. The presentation went exactly as I'd expected. Harmony Foods founders were sophisticated entrepreneurs who immediately grasped the strategic thinking behind our original approach. They asked detailed questions about consumer psychology and competitive positioning that Rebecca couldn't answer effectively. When they saw the revised version, their disappointment was obvious. This looks like every other natural food campaign we've seen, the CEO said politely. We were hoping for something that would help us stand out in a crowded market. After the clients left, having enthusiastically approved our original campaign concept, Rebecca was furious. But instead of acknowledging that our strategic approach had been validated, she focused her anger on my decision to present both versions. You completely undermined account management's authority in front of the client, she accused. This kind of insubordination creates confusion about who clients should trust for strategic guidance. The word insubordination was like a slap across the face. I'd never been spoken to that way in my professional career, and the implication that advocating for effective creative work constituted some kind of professional misconduct was both insulting and revealing. Rebecca had crossed a line from disagreeing with my creative judgment to attacking my professional character and competence. That afternoon, she requested a meeting with Richard to discuss what she called ongoing issues with creative department collaboration and client relationship management. I wasn't invited to participate in this conversation, but I could guess what narrative she was constructing about my leadership style and attitude toward account management input. The fact that our approach had resulted in a successful client outcome was apparently less important than maintaining departmental hierarchy and Rebecca's authority to override creative decisions. When Richard called me into his office the next morning, his demeanor was notably cooler than usual. Emily, Rebecca has raised some concerns about communication patterns and collaborative processes within the creative team, he began. She feels that there's resistance to incorporating account management insights into creative development and that this could impact our client relationships long term. The conversation that followed was surreal. Richard seemed to accept Rebecca's characterization of events without questioning whether her insights were actually valuable or whether her interference was improving or hindering our creative work. When I pointed out that our original approach had won the Harmony Foods account, he acknowledged that success but framed it as fortunate rather than predictable. Sometimes creative risks pay off, he said. He said, but we can't build a sustainable business model on approaches that might alienate more conservative clients. The implication was clear. My expertise and judgment were being viewed as liabilities rather than assets. Rebecca had successfully positioned herself as the voice of practical business wisdom, while I was being characterized as someone whose creative instincts needed to be managed and constrained for the good of the agency. It was a masterful political maneuver that completely inverted the actual value each of us brought to client relationships and campaign effectiveness. That evening, I sat in my car in the Meridian parking lot for 20 minutes before starting the engine to drive home. I was trying to process what was happening to my career and my sense of professional identity. For over 2 decades, I'd built my reputation on strategic thinking, creative excellence, and the ability to translate client needs into campaigns that delivered results. Now I was being told that these skills were problems to be managed rather than assets to be leveraged. When I finally made it home, Tom took one look at my face and poured 2 glasses of wine without saying a word. We sat on our back porch, and I explained what had happened in Richard's office. It's like she's rewriting the rules of how the agency operates, I said, and somehow making it seem like I'm the problem for wanting to do the work we were hired to do. Tom listened carefully, asking questions that helped me think through the situation more clearly. What does success look like for Rebecca in her role? He asked. Because it seems like her definition of success is different from yours, and she's convinced Richard that her definition is what matters. It was an insight that helped me understand why my attempts to focus on creative quality and client results weren't resonating with leadership. Rebecca was playing a different game entirely, one focused on control and departmental authority rather than effective marketing outcomes. The next few weeks brought a systematic campaign to isolate me from decision-making processes and undermine my relationships with both team members and clients. Rebecca began scheduling creative reviews without including me, then presenting the results as collaborative decisions reached by the team. She inserted herself into client communications, positioning herself as the primary strategic contact while describing me as the creative execution resource who would implement decisions made by others. Most painfully, I watched my carefully assembled team begin to doubt their own creative instincts under Rebecca's influence. Maya started writing copy that prioritized obvious keyword optimization over compelling storytelling. Jake's designs became increasingly conservative and derivative. David spent more time preparing reports that supported predetermined conclusions rather than conducting genuine analysis that might challenge conventional thinking. The creative culture we'd built together was being systematically dismantled, replaced by a hierarchical structure that valued compliance over innovation. The breaking point came during what Rebecca called a creative department restructuring meeting. Without warning or consultation, she announced that all creative work would now follow a new approval process that gave account management veto power over strategic decisions at every stage of development. This will ensure better alignment between creative concepts and client relationship priorities, she explained, as if the previous system of creative leadership and collaborative refinement had been fundamentally flawed. But the most devastating moment came when she turned to address me directly in front of the entire team. "Emily, I know this adjustment might be challenging for someone with your background," she said with a patronizing smile, "but I think you'll find that working within clearer structures actually enhances creative productivity. Sometimes the most innovative solutions come from working within constraints rather than having unlimited creative freedom." The condescending tone was bad enough, but what came next was worse. "Of course, if you find it difficult to adapt to collaborative processes, we might need to consider whether this role is the right fit for your working style." The threat was delivered with corporate politeness, but it was unmistakably a threat. Adapt to her authority or face consequences that could include termination. I looked around the conference room at my team, people I'd hired, mentored, and worked alongside to create some of the best work of my career. They were staring at their laptops or notebooks, unable to make eye contact. Maya looked like she might cry. Jake was clenching his jaw so tightly I worried about his teeth. David was typing notes with unusual intensity, probably documenting everything for his own protection. None of them spoke up, and I couldn't blame them. They were witnessing my professional authority being systematically dismantled, and speaking in my defense could put their own jobs at risk. "I understand the new process," I said finally, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "I'll need some time to review the details and consider how it impacts ongoing client commitments." Rebecca nodded as if my compliance was a foregone conclusion, but I was already planning my next move. If she wanted to play politics, I was going to make sure I understood the rules and had everything documented. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the meeting and thinking about all the moments over the past few months when I should have recognized what was happening and protected myself more effectively. Tom found me at 3 in the morning, sitting at our kitchen table with a legal pad, writing down every interaction with Rebecca I could remember, along with dates and witnesses. "What are you doing?" he asked gently. "Building a case," I replied. "If she's going to destroy my career, she's going to have to do it in a way that creates liability for the agency." It was the first time I'd acknowledged out loud that this wasn't just a professional disagreement or communication problem. Rebecca was engaged in what could only be described as a hostile takeover of the creative department, and she was using my reputation and team relationships as collateral damage. The documentation process was both therapeutic and horrifying. Writing down everything that had happened forced me to confront how systematically I'd been undermined and marginalized, but it also revealed patterns that could be interpreted as harassment or discrimination. Rebecca consistently questioned my judgment in ways she never questioned male colleagues. She dismissed my strategic expertise while deferring to less experienced men in account management. Her criticism focused on my attitude and collaboration style rather than concrete performance issues. More importantly, I realized that Rebecca's interference was damaging client relationships and agency performance in measurable ways. The Innovate Health account had been lost directly because of her changes to our presentation. 2 other clients had expressed dissatisfaction with recent work that had been filtered through her approval process. We were losing pitches to agencies that were presenting the kind of strategic, innovative approaches Rebecca was preventing us from developing. Armed with this documentation, I requested a meeting with Richard to discuss my concerns about creative department performance and client satisfaction trends. I prepared my case carefully, focusing on business impact rather than personal grievances. This wasn't about my feelings being hurt. It was about systematic changes that were harming agency competitiveness and employee morale. But when I arrived at Richard's office for our scheduled meeting, I found Rebecca already there, sitting in the chair I'd expected to occupy. "I hope you don't mind that Rebecca joined us," Richard said, though his tone suggested this wasn't actually a request. "Given that your concerns relate to departmental collaboration, I thought it would be more productive to address them together." The ambush was masterfully orchestrated. Rebecca had clearly briefed Richard on what to expect from our conversation, and she'd positioned herself as a reasonable colleague trying to help solve problems rather than the source of those problems. When I began outlining my concerns about creative process changes and their impact on client results, she was ready with counter-narratives that made my objections sound petty and self-serving. "I think what Emily is experiencing is the natural adjustment period that comes with working in a more structured environment," Rebecca said, her voice full of concern and understanding. "Change can be difficult, especially for creative personalities who are used to having complete autonomy. But our clients are telling us they appreciate the increased consistency and reliability in our strategic messaging." The phrase creative personalities was particularly galling because it suggested that my objections were emotional rather than professional. And her claim about client feedback was simply false. No client had requested the changes she'd implemented, and several had expressed confusion about recent shifts in our creative approach. But Rebecca presented these fabrications with such confidence that Richard seemed to accept them as factual. When I tried to present specific examples of how her changes had hurt client relationships, Rebecca was ready with explanations that shifted responsibility away from her decisions. The Innovate Health loss was attributed to unrealistic client expectations and miscommunication about project scope. Other client concerns were characterized as growing pains that would resolve once everyone adapted to the new processes. She had an answer for everything, delivered with the kind of corporate authority that sounded convincing if you didn't examine the details too closely. The meeting ended with Richard suggesting that I might benefit from executive coaching to develop stronger collaborative leadership skills. The implication was devastating. My decades of successful creative leadership were being reframed as personal deficiencies that needed professional correction. Rebecca nodded sympathetically, even offering to help identify appropriate coaches who specialized in creative to business communication. Walking back to my office after that meeting felt like a death march. I could see my team through the glass wall working on projects that would be filtered through Rebecca's approval process before clients ever saw them. They looked up when I passed, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern. They knew something significant was happening, but they were powerless to influence the outcome. That afternoon, I made the decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to fight within a system that had been rigged against me, I was going to gather irrefutable evidence of what was really happening and present it in a forum where Rebecca couldn't control the narrative. I started documenting everything with a level of precision I'd never applied to workplace interactions. Every email was saved and backed up. Every conversation was followed up with written summaries sent to relevant parties. Every decision was questioned in writing, creating a paper trail that revealed the patterns Rebecca had been hiding behind corporate politeness and collaborative language. I also began reaching out to former colleagues and industry contacts, ostensibly for networking purposes, but actually to understand how my reputation was being perceived outside Meridian. What I discovered was that Rebecca had been having conversations about me with other agencies and industry professionals, subtly undermining my reputation while positioning herself as someone who could provide insight into my leadership challenges and collaborative difficulties. The most shocking revelation came from Maria Santos, a former client who had moved to a different company but maintained relationships throughout the industry. Rebecca Walsh reached out last month asking if I'd be interested in some freelance consulting work. Maria told me during what I'd thought was a casual coffee meeting. She mentioned that Meridian was experiencing some creative leadership transitions and might need external support for strategic planning. "I got the impression that you were being moved into a different role." Maria's information confirmed my worst suspicions. Rebecca wasn't just trying to control my current work. She was actively positioning herself as my replacement while spreading rumors about my departure being inevitable. She was playing a longer game than I'd realized, systematically building the case for my removal while establishing herself as the obvious solution to the problems she was creating. Armed with this knowledge, I began my own strategic campaign. I reached out to 3 different employment attorneys, learning about my rights and options if the situation continued to escalate. I documented every instance where Rebecca's interference had compromised client work, including testimonials from team members who were willing to describe the impact on their creative process and job satisfaction. Most importantly, I started building relationships with board members and senior executives who weren't directly involved in the day-to-day agency operations, but who would be concerned about legal liability and reputation damage. The opportunity I'd been waiting for came when Meridian was invited to pitch for Catalyst Technologies, a startup developing sustainable energy solutions for residential use. This was exactly the kind of forward thinking client that required sophisticated strategic thinking and innovative creative approaches, the type of work that showcased everything wrong with Rebecca's generic risk averse methodology. I prepared two presentation approaches: the kind of safe, conventional campaign that Rebecca would approve, and the bold, strategically sound approach that would actually serve the client's needs. I planned to present both versions and let the results speak for themselves. But I also prepared something else: a detailed memo documenting every way Rebecca's collaborative process had compromised our creative development, including specific examples of how her changes had hurt previous client relationships. The night before the Catalyst presentation, I stayed late in the office, ostensibly making final revisions but actually confirming that I had copies of all relevant documents and communications saved to external drives. I was preparing for the possibility that this confrontation would end my employment at Meridian, and I wanted to ensure that Rebecca couldn't destroy evidence or control the narrative about what had happened. The morning of the presentation, Rebecca arrived early and immediately began reviewing our materials, using her standard process of substituting strategic thinking with corporate cliches. But this time, I was ready for her. When she suggested replacing our research-based consumer insights with generic messaging about innovative solutions for modern living, I challenged her directly. Rebecca, can you explain how that language differentiates Catalyst from the dozen other sustainable energy companies using identical positioning? I asked, my voice steady and professional. And what market research supports the assumption that generic innovation messaging is more effective than the specific consumer behavior insights we've developed? The room went silent. My team looked up from their laptops, recognizing that something significant was happening. Rebecca's face flushed, but she tried to maintain her usual authoritative demeanor. Emily, we've discussed the importance of clear, accessible messaging that doesn't confuse clients with unnecessary complexity, she said. That's when I played my hand. Actually, let's review what our clients have said about the clear, accessible changes you've implemented over the past 3 months. I opened my laptop and began reading directly from client feedback and internal communications. Innovate Health. The revised presentation felt generic and didn't address the sophisticated positioning we were hoping to achieve. Harmony Foods. We were disappointed by the initial approach and only moved forward after seeing the more strategic alternative. Sterling Manufacturing. Recent work feels significantly less innovative than the campaigns that originally attracted us to Meridian. Rebecca tried to interrupt, but I continued reading documented evidence of how her interference had damaged client relationships and agency performance. Each quote was attributed and dated, making it impossible for her to dismiss the feedback as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. My team was staring in amazement as months of frustration and suppressed concerns were finally given voice through concrete evidence. Furthermore, I continued, I have documentation showing that these performance issues correlate directly with the implementation of your collaborative approval process. In every case, client satisfaction decreased when creative work was filtered through account management rather than developed through genuine strategic collaboration. The confrontation was interrupted by Richard entering the conference room, followed by two people I didn't immediately recognize. I'm sorry to interrupt, Richard said, looking confused by the tension in the room, but the Catalyst team arrived early and they're eager to get started. Are we ready for the presentation? What happened next felt like an out-of-body experience. Rebecca immediately shifted into client-ready mode, her professional smile returning as she welcomed the Catalyst representatives. But I could see in her eyes that she knew something fundamental had changed. The dynamic between us had shifted, and she was no longer controlling the narrative about my competence and collaborative ability. The Catalyst presentation was a masterclass in the difference between strategic thinking and corporate conformity. Rebecca presented her version first, using the kind of safe, predictable messaging that could have been applied to any technology company. The clients listened politely, but their body language showed increasing disappointment as the presentation progressed. When they asked questions about competitive differentiation and target market psychology, Rebecca gave vague answers that revealed her superficial understanding of their business challenges. Then I presented our strategic approach, explaining the consumer research that revealed why existing sustainable energy marketing was failing to reach mainstream adopters. I showed them how their technology solves specific psychological barriers to adoption, not just functional problems. The creative was bold and emotionally resonant, positioning Catalyst as the company that understood what consumers really needed from sustainable energy solutions. The difference in client response was dramatic. Catalyst CEO started asking detailed follow-up questions about implementation and campaign expansion. Their marketing director took notes about strategic insights they could apply to other business challenges. They were engaged and excited in a way that Rebecca's presentation had completely failed to achieve. But the most significant moment came when Catalyst CEO addressed Rebecca directly. "I have to ask," he said, "why you would recommend the more conservative approach when the strategic version so clearly addresses our business challenges and market positioning needs. Are there implementation concerns or budget constraints we should know about?" Rebecca fumbled for an answer, eventually falling back on vague statements about managing risk and ensuring broad market appeal. But her response revealed that she couldn't articulate any legitimate business reason for preferring the weaker approach. She had been operating from assumptions about what clients wanted rather than actually understanding their needs and challenges. After the clients left, having enthusiastically approved our strategic approach and asking for expedited timeline proposals, the conference room was silent for a long moment. My team looked stunned by what they'd witnessed. Richard appeared to be processing the implications of what he'd seen, and Rebecca looked like someone who'd just watched her carefully constructed political strategy collapse in real time. "I think we need to have a broader conversation about creative development processes and client service standards," Richard said finally. "Let me review the presentation materials and client feedback, and then we'll schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss how we move forward." That afternoon, I received an email from Richard asking me to prepare a detailed analysis of creative department performance over the past 6 months, including specific recommendations for process improvements and team structure optimization. The tone was markedly different from our previous communications, more respectful of my expertise and more interested in my professional assessment of what had been happening. But I also received a message from Rebecca requesting an urgent conversation about professional boundaries and departmental communication protocols. Her tone was formal and legalistic, suggesting that she was preparing for a different kind of confrontation. I realized that while I'd won this particular battle, the war for my professional survival was far from over. That evening, Tom and I sat in our kitchen reviewing everything that had happened. "You did it," he said, looking at me with the kind of pride that made my chest tight with emotion. "You stood up for yourself and your work in a way that couldn't be dismissed or mischaracterized." But I knew that exposing Rebecca's incompetence and political maneuvering would likely escalate her efforts to eliminate me from the agency. She couldn't afford to have someone around who could document and articulate the gap between her authority and her actual expertise. The next few weeks would determine whether Meridian valued strategic competence or political control. I spent the weekend preparing for what I expected to be Rebecca's counterattack. I organized all my documentation, secured copies of relevant files and communications, and reached out to the employment attorney I'd consulted earlier. But I also did something else. I started exploring other opportunities, reaching out to former colleagues and clients who might be interested in working together outside of Meridian. The realization that I might be forced to leave wasn't devastating anymore. It was liberating. I'd spent months trying to work within a system that had been designed to marginalize my expertise and authority. Now I was beginning to consider the possibility that my talents might be better served elsewhere, either at an agency that valued strategic thinking or through my own consulting practice. Monday morning brought the counterattack I'd been expecting, but it came in a form I hadn't anticipated. Richard called me into his office and informed me that Rebecca had filed a formal complaint alleging hostile work behavior and deliberate undermining of account management authority. She was claiming that my confrontation during the Catalyst presentation constituted harassment, and that my documentation of client feedback was an attempt to sabotage her reputation and career. "Emily, I need you to understand how serious these allegations are," Richard said, his tone more formal than I'd ever heard it. "Rebecca is claiming that you've created a hostile work environment and that your behavior has made it impossible for her to do her job effectively. She's provided documentation of what she describes as a pattern of professional retaliation and intimidation." The irony was stunning. Rebecca had spent months systematically undermining my authority, sabotaging my work, and spreading rumors about my competence and collaboration skills. But she was now positioning herself as the victim of my hostile behavior because I'd finally documented and challenged her interference. She had weaponized the language of workplace protection to defend herself against accountability for her own professional misconduct. Richard handed me a folder containing Rebecca's formal complaint, along with agency HR policies about workplace behavior and disciplinary procedures. "You'll have an opportunity to respond to these allegations," he said, "but I need you to know that this kind of complaint triggers a formal investigation process. During that time, you'll be asked to avoid direct interaction with Rebecca and to work with HR on any communications that involve account management decisions." Reading through Rebecca's complaint was like entering an alternate reality where every interaction had been inverted. My attempts to advocate for effective creative work were characterized as aggressive resistance to collaborative feedback. My documentation of client dissatisfaction was described as deliberate collection of negative information to support personal vendettas. Even my expertise and strategic insights were reframed as condescending lectures designed to undermine account management credibility. But the most damaging elements of her complaint were the statements from team members who had apparently been interviewed about my leadership style and collaborative approach. Maya, Jake, and David had all provided comments that, while not directly critical, could be interpreted as supporting Rebecca's narrative about my difficulty working within structured processes and accepting input from other departments. That evening, I called the employment attorney I'd been consulting and scheduled an emergency meeting. This is a classic retaliation strategy, she explained after reviewing Rebecca's complaint. When someone's misconduct is exposed, they often flip the script and position themselves as victims of harassment. The goal is to make you the problem instead of addressing the underlying issues you've raised. She also pointed out that Rebecca's complaint contained several statements that could be challenged with the documentation I'd been gathering. Her claim that you've been uncooperative and hostile can be countered by showing how your concerns were legitimate and backed by evidence. The client feedback you documented actually supports your professional judgment rather than undermining it. More importantly, she explained that Rebecca's pattern of behavior toward me could constitute discrimination if it could be shown that she treated male colleagues differently or that her criticism focused on characteristics typically used to marginalize women in professional settings. The focus on my attitude and collaboration style rather than concrete performance issues was potentially problematic for the agency. Armed with this legal perspective, I began preparing my response to Rebecca's complaint, but I also started investigating whether other employees had experienced similar treatment from her. What I discovered was that Rebecca had a pattern of conflicts with strong female colleagues, while maintaining supportive relationships with less experienced male employees who didn't challenge her authority. Jenny Hoffman, a former account manager who had left Meridian 6 months earlier, agreed to meet with me for coffee. Rebecca made my life hell for 2 years, she told me, her relief at finally being able to talk about it obvious. She questioned every decision I made, excluded me from client meetings, and then criticized me for not being sufficiently involved in account strategy. When I finally complained to Richard, she accused me of being difficult to work with and resistant to feedback. Jenny's experience was almost identical to what I'd been experiencing, but she hadn't had the seniority or documentation to fight back effectively. She has this way of making you feel like you're crazy, Jenny continued. Like all your professional instincts are wrong, and you need her guidance to function effectively. But then she takes credit for anything that goes well and blames you for anything that doesn't. The pattern was becoming clear. Rebecca used her position and political skills to systematically undermine women who posed potential threats to her authority, while building alliances with people who supported her version of events. She had turned workplace harassment into an art form, using corporate language and HR processes to legitimize behavior that would have been recognized as bullying in a more direct form. With Jenny's permission, I included her experiences in my response to Rebecca's complaint, along with documentation showing how Rebecca's criticism of my work had damaged client relationships and team morale. I also obtained statements from former clients who were willing to describe how recent changes in our creative approach had disappointed them and made them question Meridian's strategic capabilities. The formal HR investigation took 3 weeks, during which I was required to work with limited access to client communications and restricted interaction with my team. Rebecca, meanwhile, seemed energized by the process, frequently meeting with Richard and making references to difficult personnel situations that required careful handling. She had positioned herself as the reasonable professional dealing with a problematic colleague rather than the source of the problems being investigated. But the investigation process also gave me time to prepare a comprehensive case documenting not just Rebecca's interference with my work, but the broader impact of her approach on agency performance and employee retention. I gathered data showing that creative department turnover had increased significantly since she'd implemented her collaborative processes. Client satisfaction scores had declined in measurable ways that correlated with her involvement in creative development. Even billing efficiency had decreased as projects required more revisions and approvals. The turning point came when the HR investigator interviewed Catalyst Technologies about their experience with our presentation process. The client's feedback was devastating for Rebecca's version of events. They specifically praised the strategic approach I developed and expressed confusion about why anyone would have recommended the generic alternative that didn't address their business needs. The difference between the two presentations was so significant that we wondered if they'd been prepared by different agencies. Catalyst CEO told the investigator. The strategic version demonstrated deep understanding of our market and competition, while the other approach could have been created by someone who'd never researched our industry. We couldn't understand why the account management team would prefer the weaker option. More damaging was their revelation that Rebecca had contacted them after the presentation to suggest that the strategic approach had been developed without proper account management oversight and might be difficult to implement effectively. They perceived this as an attempt to undermine the campaign they'd already approved, and it had made them question Meridian's internal communication and project management capabilities. When Richard called me into his office to discuss the investigation results, his demeanor was notably different from our previous meetings. "Emily, I owe you an apology," he began. "The investigation has revealed that many of your concerns about creative process and client service were legitimate, and that the situation has been more complex than I initially understood." He went on to explain that the HR investigator had found no evidence supporting Rebecca's claims of hostile behavior or professional harassment. Instead, the investigation had documented a pattern of interference with creative development that had measurably damaged client relationships and team performance. Several former employees had provided statements describing similar experiences with Rebecca's management style and approach to collaborative work. Most importantly, Richard continued, "We've discovered that Rebecca has been making unauthorized contact with clients and industry professionals in ways that misrepresent agency personnel and processes. This constitutes a serious breach of professional conduct and client relationship protocols." What followed was the most satisfying conversation of my career. Richard explained that Rebecca was being placed on administrative leave pending a broader review of her conduct and performance. The collaborative approval process she'd implemented was being immediately suspended, and creative development would return to the team-based approach that had been successful before her interference. "I also want to discuss your role going forward," Richard said. "It's clear that your strategic expertise and client relationship skills are essential to our continued success. I'd like to offer you a promotion to Senior Creative Director with expanded authority over creative department operations and strategic planning." The promotion came with a significant salary increase, but more importantly, it came with formal authority to establish creative development processes and protect the team from future political interference. I would report directly to Richard rather than working through intermediate management layers, and I would have input into hiring and departmental structure decisions. But the real victory came 2 weeks later, when Meridian was awarded not just the Catalyst Technologies account, but a major expansion project that positioned us as their primary marketing partner for a national launch campaign. The client specifically requested that I lead the strategic development and that our creative process remain insulated from account management interference. Rebecca's departure from the agency was handled quietly, with corporate language about pursuing new opportunities and mutual agreement about career direction. But industry networks being what they are, word spread quickly about what had really happened. Several former clients reached out to congratulate me on finally getting the recognition and authority your work deserves. The most meaningful validation came from my team. Maya, Jake, and David approached me together the day after Rebecca's departure was announced, and Maya spoke for all of them. "Emily, we want you to know that we never supported what was happening to you," she said. "We felt powerless to speak up without risking our own jobs, but we documented everything because we knew it was wrong." They had been keeping their own records of how Rebecca's interference had compromised their work and job satisfaction. David had tracked the correlation between her involvement and decreased client satisfaction. Jake had saved examples of how his creative concepts had been weakened by her improvements. Maya had documented how the approval process had made it impossible to develop the kind of sophisticated copy that clients expected from a strategic agency. "We were planning to speak up during the investigation," Jake added, "but we wanted to make sure we could protect ourselves if things went badly. When we heard that you'd already documented everything and that clients were supporting your version of events, we knew it was safe to tell the truth." Their support meant everything, but it also highlighted how much damage workplace harassment and political manipulation can cause to team dynamics and professional relationships. We'd spent months walking on eggshells, unable to collaborate effectively because we were all protecting ourselves from a system that had been designed to pit us against each other. Over the following months, we rebuilt the creative culture that had been systematically dismantled during Rebecca's tenure. We reinstated regular brainstorming sessions where everyone's ideas were valued and developed collaboratively. We returned to our practice of challenging each other's thinking in service of stronger creative solutions. Most importantly, we reestablished trust in each other, in our creative process, and in leadership's commitment to protecting our ability to do excellent work. The Catalyst campaign became a showcase for everything that was possible when creative teams were allowed to function without political interference. Our strategic approach helped them achieve a 43% increase in qualified leads within the first quarter, and their national expansion exceeded revenue projections by nearly 60%. Industry publications featured the campaign as an example of how sophisticated marketing strategy could accelerate startup growth and market penetration. But the personal victory was even more meaningful than the professional recognition. I'd learned that standing up for my expertise and professional values wasn't just about protecting my own career. It was about creating a workplace culture where excellence could flourish and where political manipulation couldn't override strategic thinking and creative innovation. 6 months after Rebecca's departure, I received a LinkedIn message from a creative director at a competing agency. "I heard what happened at Meridian," she wrote. "I'm dealing with something similar here, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to share any advice about documenting issues and protecting yourself while advocating for your team and creative work." That message led to a series of conversations with other senior creative professionals who had experienced workplace harassment, political manipulation, and systematic undermining of their expertise and authority. What I discovered was that my experience wasn't unique. It was part of a broader pattern of how toxic personalities and poor leadership could corrupt creative cultures and damage agency performance. These conversations inspired me to start speaking about workplace advocacy and professional protection at industry conferences and creative leadership forums. I developed workshops about documenting workplace issues, building strategic alliances, and advocating for creative excellence within political organizational structures. The response was overwhelming, with numerous professionals sharing their own experiences and asking for guidance about protecting themselves and their teams. The most rewarding aspect of this advocacy work has been hearing from people who successfully challenged workplace harassment and political manipulation using strategies we discussed. Jenny Hoffman, the former account manager who had been forced out by Rebecca, used documentation techniques I'd shared to expose similar behavior at her new agency. The result was systemic policy changes that protected creative teams from account management interference and established clear protocols for addressing professional misconduct. Tom has been my strongest supporter throughout this entire journey, celebrating every victory and helping me process the more difficult aspects of standing up to workplace injustice. "You didn't just save your own career," he told me recently. "You showed other people that they don't have to accept being treated badly just because someone has political power or authority." Looking back on this experience, I'm struck by how much I learned about the difference between leadership authority and political manipulation. Rebecca had positioned herself as a leader and team player, but her actual behavior was focused on control and self-protection, rather than achieving excellent results for clients and creating positive working conditions for colleagues. Real leadership requires expertise, integrity, and the willingness to make decisions based on what serves long-term goals rather than short-term political advantage. It means protecting team members from interference and harassment, rather than using organizational power to silence criticism or avoid accountability. Most importantly, it means recognizing that sustainable success comes from building cultures where excellence is valued and rewarded rather than suppressed or undermined. The creative industry has always attracted strong personalities and competitive dynamics, but that doesn't mean we have to accept toxic behavior or political manipulation as inevitable parts of professional life. When leaders prioritize protecting their own authority over achieving excellent results, they create environments where everyone's performance suffers and the most talented people are driven away. If you're experiencing workplace harassment, political manipulation, or systematic undermining of your professional expertise, please know that you're not alone and that there are strategies for protecting yourself while advocating for positive change. Document everything with dates and witnesses. Gather evidence of how problematic behavior affects work quality and client relationships. Build alliances with colleagues and industry professionals who can provide support and validation. Most importantly, don't let anyone convince you that standing up for your professional values and expertise is somehow problematic or inappropriate. You have the right to work in an environment where your contributions are valued and where political manipulation can't override strategic thinking and creative excellence. Remember that toxic personalities often use corporate language and HR processes to legitimize behavior that would be recognized as harassment in more direct forms. They position themselves as victims when their misconduct is exposed, and they try to make you feel like you're the problem for refusing to accept unacceptable treatment. But the truth has a way of emerging when you document everything carefully and advocate for yourself strategically. Clients recognize the difference between excellent work and political convenience. Colleagues appreciate leaders who protect creative excellence and team well-being, and organizations that want to succeed long-term must eventually choose between supporting competence and enabling manipulation. If you've experienced workplace injustice or professional harassment, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Share where you're watching from and let me know what strategies have helped you advocate for yourself and your teams. Building professional community and mutual support is one of the most effective ways to challenge toxic workplace cultures and create environments where excellence can flourish. Subscribe to this channel for more content about workplace advocacy, creative leadership, and professional development. Together, we can create industries where talent and integrity are valued over politics and manipulation, where speaking truth to power is supported rather than punished, and where everyone has the opportunity to do their best work without fear of retaliation or harassment. Your career, your expertise, and your professional values matter. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise.